Welcome to the second day of the 7th IPRA conference. My name is Hazel Bateman and I'm chair of the first session today. So we're going to start off this morning with a session addressing the gaps in pension coverage. We've got three terrific speakers. So we have John Reuter, who's an associate professor in finance at Boston College. We have Brière, who is head of research at the Amundi Institute. And we have Will Sandbrook, who is managing director of strategy, analytics and Nest Insight at Nest. And all three of our speakers have a long history in pensions research, engagement with the pensions industry, and they've all published their research in good academic journals. So we have a terrific team this morning. So I'd like to invite our first speaker, John. And John will be talking about auto-enrollment retirement plans for people, choices and outcomes in OregonSaves.
Good morning or evening, depending on where you happen to be. Nice to be here. It's my first visit to the OECD. I like it very much. This is joint work with John, Olivia, and Ming Lee. And as we just heard, the title of the paper is Auto-Enrollment Retirement Plans for the People, Choices and Outcomes in OregonSaves. So let me give you a sense of what this is all about. So in the U.S., Social Security is kind of the best-known retirement system. It's the one that reaches the most people. It's not intended to be the only source of retirement income, but for lower-income people, it de facto tends to be. However, when you think about additional sources of savings, what you'll typically think about is an employer-sponsored plan. And in the U.S., only about half of employees who work in the private sector have access to a retirement plan. You know, and not all of those avail themselves of it, but most do. But what that means is that we have another half of workers without access to retirement savings. And those without access tend not to save on their own. They could open an individual retirement account. The vast majority do not. So what's happened in the U.S. is that there's not been a federal response to this, but a number of states, I think at this point it's up to 20 states, have responded to the perceived retirement crisis by introducing their own retirement plans. They all have a very similar structure. They're all based on auto-enrollment. And the first one to launch was in Oregon. It's called OregonSaves, and it launched back in 2017. At this point, California and several larger states have launched, but Oregon is kind of going as far back as we can go in the data. And so what you can think about, and when Will talks about Nest, I think some of this will be similar, but OregonSaves' goal is to increase retirement savings, and the goal is to leverage what we know from behavioral finance to do that. And there's some seminal work by Bridget Madrian and Shay looking at what happens when you add auto-enrollment to a 401k plan. And what they found was, a 401k, a traditional defined contribution retirement plan. And so what they found was very large effects on participation. People's participation rates went up to about 85 percentage points, right? So very high levels of participation. What's happened in the intervening 20 years is that there's been a lot of work that's actually begun to question the long-term net effects of auto-enrollment on savings behavior. And so the two papers I cite here both essentially conclude that it looks like the net savings effect may just be equal to whatever employer match has been put into the program. And so it's an important thing to keep in mind because when we're going to be talking about OregonSaves is a very different structure than a 401k plan. And in particular, it's not going to have an employer match. So if you think that that's driving a lot of behavior in other settings, that's going to be missing from my setting. And so what I want to ask is, given that OregonSaves is targeting lower income, high turnover industries, who should be participating, who does participate, and what are they saving? Right? Okay. So if the goal is to meaningfully increase the fraction of workers with large retirement savings, they need to participate at the beginning, and they need to continue participating throughout their career. And so there are four questions that I want to ask and briefly answer that are going to help us understand this. The first is, which industries are actually being targeted by this program? They're going to be a different industry mix than has traditionally had access to retirement savings in the U.S. through employers. Who chooses to participate and how much do they save? What does the effective savings rate look like compared to the default rate? And so by effective savings rate, what I'm thinking about here is kind of the intention to treat estimate, which is how much savings do we generate within the population of people that we're reaching relative to what would have happened if everyone participated. And then the last question, which I won't have a lot to say about because of when my data end, but I think is really an important question to think about in the context of these programs, is should we really be thinking about this as retirement savings or as precautionary savings? Okay. All right, so plan design. So the way all of these state plans work is that the state tells employers you need to begin offering a plan like OregonSaves or OregonSaves to your employees. So as an employer, you can either respond by adding a 401k plan right away, or you can participate in the Oregon program. Virtually everyone participates in the Oregon program. It was a staggered rollout, large employers first, smaller employers later. It's an after-tax savings rate, so they take 5% of your after-tax income deposited into the program. There's auto-escalation, but I'm going to be looking at kind of essentially the first year of the program for a lot of people, and so that's not going to be relevant. And as I've said, there's no employer match, which is important to bear in mind. Now, the way this plan is structured also is useful to think about, which is that the first $1,000 in contributions are put into a money market fund, which is a very safe, low-risk investment option. $1,001 gets put into a target date fund. So a target date fund is going to be a fund, as many of you know, that's going to have a high allocation to equity when you're young and a low allocation to equity when you get towards this target date. And so again, unlike a lot of the retirement plans that people have studied where the default is to put people immediately into something like a target date fund, here the first $1,000 go into something very different. And that was basically because they didn't want to put people's money into the market without them fully realizing that that's where their money was. There was a concern that people might not realize when they've been added to the program. And so that's intended to help cover this up. All right, so we received administrative data from the state of Oregon. The data began in August 2018. So the program started in 2017. 2018, we got a snapshot of the program and information on kind of historically what had happened with people. And then in April 2020, right as COVID was kind of crushing this part of the US, that our data feeds ended. And we can talk about that maybe later, why they ended. But the data we have in April 2020, at the end of our sample, there were almost 300,000 employer-employee matches. And so for us, the unit of observation is like basically the job pairing between an employer and employee. We see data every month. We know things like your age, when you were eligible to join, whether you were employed or not. We know your savings rate, although honestly, for everyone, it's basically just the 5% default, and then if there's auto-escalation, it just goes up. There's essentially no variation in terms of how people's savings rate varies. It's like, it's either you're in or you're out. Like that's really the variation we see. We know when you opt out, we know why you say you opt out, and then for employers, we know your industry, location, and when you join the program. And then we have some public data that was brought online to help get a sense of what's happened since. So the first chart here is intended to give us a sense of differences in coverage. And so each of these bars represents a different industry. Each of these pairs of bars represents a different industry. And the yellow bars are telling us about where employers, or actually employees, are located in plans that offer, in firms that offer 401k plans. That's the traditional set of firms that have been studied in a lot of US academic research. The green bars are the industries that are being covered by OregonSaves. And that really large green bar on the far left is food services, so restaurant workers, fast food and non-fast food restaurants. The next biggest is temporary agencies, so basically temporary work agencies. You go and you get positioned at a firm for a little while and you leave. And then we have healthcare, but the yellow bar for healthcare is hospitals, and the green bar for healthcare is home health workers, right? People who are basically traveling nurses and people who are going to people's houses. So what we see is a very different mix of industries, and even within industries, we see a very different mix of the types of jobs that are being covered. So the average monthly income is about $2,400. So we're talking about, let's say, $29,000 a year, which is, you know, far below the median household income in the US, which is in the 50s. The within worker standard deviation, so what we're doing is we're following a given person over time. The average income is about $2,400. But across months, the standard deviation of income is about 900. So there's a ton of variability within a given person across months in income. Some of this is due to pay cycles, but we do what we can to take care of that, and it's still a really large degree of variability. So these people have very volatile incomes, right? That's the takeaway there. And the turnover rate here is about 38%. I actually think that's a vast underestimate of the actual turnover rate in our data, and I'll mention why in a minute. So we're targeting different group of workers. Measuring a participation rate is actually a hard thing to do in a program that's being introduced. We don't know what the steady state is. There are 11,000 employers that are covered. So 11,088 employers have begun adding their workers. But by the end of our sample period, half of those employers have not processed a single contribution. So they have workers in the system. Some of those workers have positive desired savings rates. No contributions have flown from those workers or into those workers' accounts from those employers. Maybe a problem with how the plan was set up. In terms of the employee level decisions, 58.5% of the people have not opted out, so 41.5% opt out. That's a much higher opt-out rate than in other settings, but again, we're looking at lower income, more volatile workers. Among the employees at employers that have processed any contributions, only a third have a positive account balance by the end of our sample. So what you're seeing is 40% of people opt out, but only a third of the people actually accumulate any assets. Okay. And so when we plot, the green dashed bar at the bottom here is giving us a sense of kind of opt-outs, and the top is giving us a sense of who we think is, sorry, the bottom is giving us a sense of who's actually saving, and the top is giving us a sense of opt-out rates or participation rates, I should say. And we're finding this really big gap between the two. And this gap doesn't tend to appear in other settings. It's appearing in our setting because there's a huge amount of turnover. And I think what's going on is that in our data, some employers will tell us when an employee has been fired. Most of them don't see any reason to tell us that, and so they don't, right? And so the statistics which we would take for granted and is really important to us is kind of an incomplete statistic. Okay, so what predicts opting out? And so we have a survey, and the survey where we gave some questions to the plan administrator that they ran from the very beginning of the program. And the most popular answer, about a quarter of the people who opt out say, I can't afford to save, which is really not that surprising. About another quarter say, I have my own retirement plan. If this is true, it's a perfectly valid reason not to participate in the program. The other data we have on the savings rate of this group of people would suggest that that's an overestimate. I'm not sure I believe that all these people have their own retirement plan unless they're thinking of Social Security, which they may be thinking of. Okay. So we have a series of kind of statistical analyses that we run. Essentially what happens is the older you are, the less likely you are to participate. The higher your industry income is, the more likely you are to opt out. But the lower your income, and then the lower your income is within your employer, the more likely you are to opt out. So we're seeing basically opt out on both ends of the spectrum, which is actually consistent with people saying I can't afford to save and I already have a plan. We find that if you turn over, you don't bother to opt out, right? If you were just fired, why would you then fill out the form opting out of OregonSaves? But you also don't accumulate any assets. So again, I think turnover here is a big driver of this gap that we're finding. In terms of what's going on in the program, the lines on the left side are showing you what's happening during our sample period, and the lines on the right are showing you what happened after we lost access to data, but the program continued to grow. And so I'll just give you some of the numbers on the next slide. I think, there we go. So at the beginning of our sample period, there were about 18,000 participants. At the end of our sample period, there were about 68,000. These are people with positive account balances. By the end of our sample period, or sorry, by the end of basically the last public data I could get, there were 114,000 people with positive account balances. So the program has continued to grow after they stopped sharing the data with us. But it seems to have plateaued at this level, and it's unclear there are additional employers to be added. So this may be, at least for a while, kind of the steady state number. The average account balance at the end of our sample period is $754. So that means that those people have all of their money in the money market fund because they've not gotten to the $1,000 threshold yet. The account balance at the end of April 2022, it's about $1,300. So those people are finally getting some exposure to equity markets, which is why actually in the previous slide, you start to see some volatility in the balances. The bottom panel is talking about dispersion, and a graph probably would have been more useful here, but the way to think about it is the people in the bottom table are going to join our sample when they save some money the first time. So month 1 is the month of their first contribution. So month 3 is 3 months in. Month 12 is 12 months after that first contribution. And what you see is that the averages are going up. The medians are going up, but they stall at month 9 and kind of plateau. the 25th percentile is actually declining a little bit, and the 70th percentile is growing. And so what's going on is that basically a ninth of the people who are exposed to the program overall have growing account balances. A third of the people put something in, but after a year have basically stopped contributing, and it's just plateaued at whatever that was. Okay, so here what I'm trying to do is get a sense of persistence. And so what the left chart is doing is it is taking people who've been around for 6 months, 12 months, or 18 months and asking, what is the likelihood that you've made a given number of payments? So the red line in the middle there on the left panel is telling us that basically after you made your first contribution, 5 months later, 60% of people have actually made 5 more contributions. So you've got about 60% of the people have contributed consistently for 6 months, but by 12 months, that's fallen to 30%. So again, we're having kind of this like loss of contributions. What the right panel's doing is it is trying to figure out why that's happening. And so the very bottom bar, the dark blue bar on my screen, is showing people who officially opt out. So there are a small number of people who opt out very quickly after being in the program because they didn't realize they were in the program, is our understanding. So about 12%. Then the light blue bar are people who set their contribution rate to 0, who are still actively employed. And then that kind of gray bar is people that we think still have a positive contribution rate. We think they're still employed, but their contributions have magically disappeared. And so again, we think this is basically unreported turnover in the system. And as you can see, there are lots of ways that we're losing people here. Some of it's by choice, and a lot of it's by turnover. Okay. So as policymakers, we want to think about what the effective savings rate is. If you had 100% participation in this program during the first year, what we would find is a 5% effective savings rate, because that's the default savings rate. That's basically the rate everyone would stick with. If we had 100% participation, that's where we'd end up. If you focus only on the subset of people who contribute, the third of the people who contribute, they have about $700 balance at the end of 1 year. If you calculate that as a fraction of their imputed annual income, you get to a 2.5% savings rate. So among people who begin to participate, you have an effective savings rate of 2.5%. If you then expand that to think about larger groups of people, you end up with obviously a much lower rate, right? Because you have people who are opted out and you have people who have turnover. If you include the people who opt out, but you kind of set aside the turnover, the effective savings rate falls to 1.5%. If you expand it to just include everyone, the rate goes to below 1 percentage point, right? So we have this program, it's intended to increase savings, it's increasing savings for a small fraction of these people. Meaningful savings, a lot of people are not saving anything, a lot of people are saving just a little bit. Okay, so I think it becomes reasonable to ask, should we think about these retirement savings? If you have less than $1,000, should we think about that as a retirement savings account after a year, or should we think about it as emergency savings? The way the plan is structured, people have access to this money penalty-free, so they can pull the money back out. If our data actually extended into COVID in any meaningful way, we might have been able to say something useful about this. What I can say instead is that we do see job turnovers in the data. They're not a very good predictor of withdrawals from the program. So we can see, I just turned over this month or I turned over last month. That does result in me making an increased, it does increase the likelihood of a withdrawal, but not very, very much. Mostly what happens is that at some point someone decides to opt out and they just pull all their money out. And that doesn't seem to be correlated with turnover in our data. During COVID, it might be different, but again, our data end in April 2020. So April 2020 was the first month in the US when everything shut down. And what we see in our data is that in April 2020, inflows fall dramatically. Our employment rates don't change because no one's really updated job turnover rates, but we see huge drop in inflows, no change in outflows. Of course, there were US kind of assistance plans that went into effect, so we might not have expected outflows right away. Okay, so to summarize, so OregonSaves is serving a very different type of worker than the workers who have access to 401k plans in the US. We're finding a much lower participation rate than those earlier studies would suggest, or also than we're going to see in the UK. I don't think it's irrational for low-income, high-turnover workers not to choose to participate in this program. We don't have a good benchmark of what the optimal number should be, but I think it would have been a mistake to assume the 401k numbers were the right benchmark for this population. I don't think that Oregon liked what our numbers were. I think they would have liked them to look more like a 401k plan, but I don't think that was realistic. So what we're finding is modest dispersed account balances after 12 months, and that dispersion just persists to the end of our sample period. And so really, I think what we can conclude in our setting for these workers is that behavioral nudges are useful. They're increasing savings, particularly for about a ninth of the people in a meaningful way. But really, behavioral nudges cannot overcome a lack of income or the volatility of income that this population has to live with. That's it.
Terrific. Thank you very much, John. And so I'd like to hand over to Marie.
Thank you very much, Hazel. So it's a great pleasure to be there. I enjoyed a lot the conference so far. So I'm going to talk about precautionary liquidity and choice overload in French employer-sponsored savings plans. It's joint work with Jim Potterba and Ariane Safars. So the motivation for this work is this policy debate, as you mentioned, Hazel, that shall we authorize more flexible pension withdrawals either at retirement or before retirement? And there is considerable heterogeneity across countries in what is currently authorized, from no withdrawals, for example, in Germany, to early withdrawals with a penalty, like in the US for IRAs, or in Australia, for example, there are withdrawals possible, but for exceptional reasons only. But there is a lot of debate if we should authorize more flexibility. It has been introduced in the UK. There is also this debate with the Dutch regulatory reform. It might be authorized as well at retirement. So in the end, one important question is what should be the liquidity feature of an optimal retirement saving? And it's a complicated question because with liquid savings, prison-biased individuals might not save adequately for retirement. But on the other hand, participants might attach value to liquidity, to precautionary liquidity, as you mentioned, John, and this might also incentivize them to save. So we're going to look at French employer savings plans, and they have one particular feature which is quite interesting from an international perspective, because these French savings plans, they offer two types of saving vehicle at the same time. A medium-term option, where the money can be withdrawn without any penalty after 5 years, so it's moderately liquid if you wish. And then there is another long-term option where the money can only be withdrawn until retirement. So you have these two saving vehicles at the same time, and in both vehicles also the money can be withdrawn without penalty for exceptional reasons, a bit like in Australia, for example. So we can compare how employees behave in firms that are offering these long-term vehicles and firms that are not offering the long-term vehicles because they are not mandatory, so firms basically choose. So just very quickly, I'm not going to detail the functioning of the French system. It's very close to the 401k in the US. It's very also large in terms of coverage because all firms with more than 50 employees have, it's mandatory to offer such saving schemes. And in practice, around 53% of the French employees in the private sector have such plans. So it's very, very widely used. So here comes our research question. We're going to ask how does the presence of both a medium-term and a long-term saving vehicle with this limited access under hardship conditions only affect participants' behavior. And as you were mentioning, there are some questions around that, right? For example, this paper that you were mentioning by Beschers and co-authors, they have an experimental setting in the US, and they show that workers prefer accounts with a larger withdrawal penalty that offer a better commitment to save, for example. On the other hand, this paper by Chukmeni, for example, in 2021, showed on 401k administrative data that when you raise the default contribution rate, some individuals opt out of the plan completely. And it's, as I mentioned, not completely clear-cut because sophisticated prison-biased worker might prefer the long-term option, while either naive prison-biased or just neoclassical economic agents with a preference for liquidity might favor the medium-term one. So what we find in this paper are three different sources of evidence of a preference for liquid accounts. I'm going to show you that there is a lower take-up of the default, which has a long-term component, because it depends on the plan setup, but some defaults have a long-term component, some defaults do not have. And we also find that combined with choice overload, this preference can turn some workers away from the savings plan, so they completely opt out of the plan. The second evidence I'm going to show you is that there is a higher take-up of the long-term option when there is a higher match differential between the long-term and the medium-term plan. People like to be compensated to go in the long-term. And the last piece of evidence is about hardship withdrawals. I will show you that they are done in priority from the long-term saving vehicle. So I want to confess that it's based on the comparison between workers' choice in firms with and without long-term plan. But of course, we are not claiming causality because these plans are endogenously chosen by firms, right? They choose if they're going to offer a long-term plan or not. And that's, of course, one of the main caveats of what we're doing here. So let me summarize the choice setting for workers. So workers receive variable remuneration. They can also make voluntary contribution to the plan, and the contributions can be matched by an employer. They can opt out of the plan or save in the plan. So if they opt out, the variable remuneration they receive will be taxed as wage. And of course, they will forego the possible matching contribution. Also, if the plan offers company stock, the discount that could be offered in that. Otherwise, they save in the plan, and here they also have two choices. Either they accept the default, and then the variable remuneration is invested according to the default allocation. And importantly, if the plan has a long-term option, part of the variable remuneration will go automatically in this long-term option by default. If the plan doesn't have, everything goes in the medium-term option. And if they do not like that, they can opt out of the default. They remain in the plan, they make their own choice in terms of funds, in terms of the split between medium-term and long-term. They can do that as they wish, right? So they can make this active investment allocation and across the savings plans maturities. So very importantly, as I said, if the plan has a long-term option, the default must include long-term investment. So there are other features. The long-term default should be a balanced fund, the medium-term one a low risk, but it's less important for our setting. So I'm going to show you empirical evidence from, or sample is drawn from administrative data from Amundi. And so Amundi is the largest asset management in France and also in Europe. It's also the largest provider of this French employer savings plan, because I'm part of that. We are having more than 50% of the French market, so it's very large. Here we're going to focus on employees that work in firms with more than 50 employees, because in this case it's mandatory to offer these saving vehicles. Our sample is made of 650,000 employees in more than 1,500 firms, and we're looking at 2017. So these are descriptive statistics, so I see it's hardly visible, but I'm just willing to maybe highlight. So on the left, you have averages across firms. On the right, averages across individuals. So as you can see, maybe we can focus on averages across individuals. 51% of individuals have access to these long-term savings. Interestingly, also 65% have access to employer stock, which is one feature that is particularly attractive to workers. People love employer stock, despite the drawbacks of it. And 68% also of the individuals, they have access to a match. And the take-up of the plan is 87%. The take-up of the default, so it's quite high, huh? And the take-up of the default is 25%. So it's relatively low. So that's the first evidence I wanted to show you, that there is a lower take-up. So the gap is really big between the take-up of the default options in plans with and without the long-term option. So without the long-term options, it's 41%. It's 9% when there is a long-term option. And that's true even if the plans with the long-term options are more attractive. And in particular, when there is a match, so we see, you see here on the left, these are the averages of the characteristics of plans without long-term options. On the right is with long-term options. And you see that the plans having a long-term options, they offer more company stock, they offer more match, much more. So 90% versus 45%. So they should be more attractive to employees. And that's also confirmed with our regression results. So if you control for individual characteristics, if you control also for firm characteristics, we find consistently across all specifications that in firms with long-term savings plans, so they're offering these long-term saving options, people take less the default option. So individuals are less likely, 26% less likely to take the default. So the way we interpret it is that some workers dislike the illiquid nature of the long-term savings and they opt out of the default just to avoid it. Interestingly, we also had a look at the take-up of the plan. So now you have these two sets of bars. On the right, this is the take-up of the default, what I just showed you, and now I added on the left the take-up of the plan, and you see there is also a gap, much smaller, of course, but when there is no long-term option, the take-up of the plan is 90%. When there is a long-term option, the take-up of the plan is slightly lower at 84%. Again, if we run the same set of regressions and by controlling with this plan and individual characteristics, we find that across specification, it's quite consistent that when the plan has a long-term saving component, individuals are 13% less likely to take the plan. So some workers may dislike the long-term option, but as I said in the first place, it can be avoided by just making an active choice. Now you can always, if you're not satisfied with the money going in the long-term option, you could make an active choice and then decide to put everything in the medium-term plan. But it looks like some people do not do that. And maybe because of choice overload, because it's quite costly to look into that, make your own choice, quite complicated as well. So it could explain why, so this choice overload could explain why some workers opt out completely of the plan rather than making this active choice. So it looks like this cost of decision making is larger than the benefits of participation for some workers. Interestingly, we find some heterogeneous effects. The young individuals, for example, they tend to be particularly sensitive to illiquidity. So these people are the ones for which the money is blocked for the longest time, right? Because it's blocked, remember, in the long-term plan until retirement, unless you have these cheap conditions that allow you to get access to the money. And we find that these young people, they have a lower take-up on the left of the two graphs. They have both a lower take-up of the default and also a lower take-up of the plan. The second piece of empirical evidence I wanted to show you is about the sensitivity of the take-up of the long-term options this time, depending on the match rate differential. So we're now going to see if there is a difference in the take-up of the long-term option, depending on the difference between the match rate on the long-term option and on the medium-term option. Here on this very simple graph, you can already see the picture that when the match rate differential is lower or equal to 0, and it's mostly 0 in most cases, the take-up of the long-term option is 38%, and it grows when the match rate becomes positive. The match rate differential becomes positive. It's 63% when it's below 0 and 100%. It's 72% when it's large and higher than 100%. In the same set of regression settings, we find a very large sensitivity of the take-up of the long-term option to this match rate differential, and a 100% increase in the match rate differential increases the participation by 12%. So it looks like workers need to be compensated for the illiquidity of the long-term plan to accept to save in that. The last piece of evidence, which is still ongoing work on our side, so I'm going to show you just descriptive statistics because we are still working on that. It's about the withdrawal that people make from the long-term saving vehicles. So it's quite interesting to notice that, so here the descriptive statistics that you see are how people withdraw money. So these are people it's a subsample of the people I was showing you before, but that's the one who have unlocked money in 2016. So these people have money that they could access without any penalty, which has been saved in the medium-term plan. It is for more than 5 years, so it can be already accessed. So they have already liquid savings, these people. Interestingly, out of these people that could withdraw money, 71% do not withdraw. So they keep the money even if they could have access to that without any difficulty. 25.9% have unlocked money withdrawals. And then, interestingly, we're going to look at the hardship withdrawals. So people that are making withdrawal under these hardship conditions that are basically unemployment, if you get a child, if you get married, if you are disabled. So these are quite serious life events. And we find that they are not so numerous, so only 4.4% of the people in our sample are making these hardship withdrawals. But interestingly, out of these 4.4%, 69% had unlocked money and didn't touch their unlocked money. So they took the money from the hardship condition, so that they get a child or they have a life event, they take the money that was locked in the long-term plan, but they do not touch the unlocked money. So it's quite interesting. And when we look at how people withdraw money from the two plans, it's also quite interesting to see. So here you have 3 bars. On the left, these are people that have only a medium-term plan. And we see that these people having only a medium-term plan, when they make a hardship withdrawal, they withdraw 86% of the money which is here. So they keep a little bit in that, but they make a very large withdrawal. On the right, you have 2 bars. And these are people having both a medium-term and a long-term plan. And here you see there is a huge gap between the amount they withdraw from the long-term and the amount they withdraw from the medium-term. When they have these hardship withdrawal conditions, they withdraw 92% of the long-term plan, and they withdraw only 68% from the medium-term plan. So it looks like they take the opportunity to withdraw, to take out as much as they can from the long-term plan, leaving more money from the medium-term plan. So to conclude, what we find here is that plan attributes affect participation, even when these potentially unattractive features can be avoided by active choices. Saving plan liquidity reduces participation, reduces the use of default, especially among young people that are locked for a longer period. Some participants appear to opt out rather than make active choices to avoid the default. We interpret it as maybe a result of choice overload. And then workers need to be compensated for the liquidity loss that comes with the long-term saving vehicle, so with a higher match rate typically on the long-term versus the medium-term vehicle. And finally, some workers make use of hardship withdrawal to offset the nudge, as you were mentioning, John, offset the nudge into the long-term savings. So we think it is evidence of precautionary liquidity motives, meaning the preference for holding more liquid assets, not because of immediate consumption needs, but because of possible future needs, right? And it's quite interesting that there is already some evidence of these precautionary liquidity motives in other domains, for example, in banking, where you can see that people, they both have deposits and they lend, for example, or also in consumer finance, where if you look at delinquencies on credit card and house loans, you see that people prefer to default on the house loans in order to keep the possibility to borrow from the credit card, right? So this possibility of having access to liquidity seems to be very important. And also, Hazel, you have a recent paper also showing that the early withdrawals during the COVID, they were a big number of them were also done because of these precautionary liquidity motives. So it's still work in progress. We want to look at the impact of introducing a long-term saving vehicle by some firms, and also the saving behavior after the hardship withdrawals. So there is still work to be done on that. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Marie. And now I'd like to ask our third speaker, Will, to make his presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Hazel, and thanks to my fellow panellists to absolutely really fascinating presentation. So what I'm going to talk about today is essentially kind of overview of the changes in the UK system and how they've worked since the introduction of automatic enrolment, which I'll describe a bit in a moment. This is not research from a single paper. It's more descriptive analysis from a range of different data sources, some sub-national and some nest specific. But I think it does actually, particularly in relation to John's presentation, make quite a nice compare and contrast opportunity, because there are some clear similarities and also some clear differences between those two cases. So here's what I'll cover. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to how the UK system works, talk specifically about the impact of the introduction of automatic enrolment in terms of opt-out and participation rates in the system, talk a little bit about what we've seen in terms of the resilience of that system in the face of first the pandemic and to a tiny degree more recently the cost of living crisis, talk about what I see to be some of the challenges with the auto-enrollment model as we've applied it in the UK, and then talk a little bit about the self-employed who are one of those challenges, and what, if anything, can be done to address take-up among the self-employed, which sort of links to some degree to some of the discussion yesterday about informal workers. And then finally, I'll just talk a little bit about some of the kind of emerging future policy debates in the UK system, which turns 10 this year, and so there's a sort of natural degree of reflection going on in the UK about kind of what comes next. So I won't talk to this slide, sorry, it's a busy slide, I won't talk to it in huge detail, other than to highlight that kind of historically, the UK system was deeply complicated and had a pillar one that was trying to do a bunch of different things, and a kind of patchy, sort of generous in some places, DB second pillar or second and third pillar. In 2012, following a lot of the logic underpinning the World Bank model that we discussed yesterday, a set of reforms were introduced which essentially sought to make the first pillar more clearly a simple flat rate redistributive component, and then introduce mandatory automatic enrolment for essentially all employers. So the mandate sits with the employer. They are obliged to automatically enrol all eligible workers into a qualifying workplace pension scheme. Individuals have the right to opt out, but where they don't, they're entitled to a minimum employer contribution in addition to their own contribution. And the minimum framework there is the minimum contribution rate is 8% of a band of earnings, of which at least 3% has to come from the employer. And so once you factor in tax relief, in effect, the kind of standard default setup is 3% from the employer, 4% from the individual, and 1% in the form of tax relief. Final thing to say on this, just to clarify, so Nest operates similarly to OregonSaves in as much as it is an option that employers have to meet their obligations to automatically enrol. No employer is obliged to use Nest. They can set their own plan up, or they can take a plan from a commercial provider, but any employer who wants to use Nest can, and Nest has an obligation to accept any employer wishing to use them. So the mandate to automatically enrol covers all eligible workers in employers of any size, right down to kind of employers employing one person, kind of couple employing a nanny is the example that often gets given. But there is some complexity in defining worker eligibility, and again, I won't go into it in huge detail here, but essentially the core group of workers to whom automatic enrolment applies are those aged 22 to state pension age and earning at least £10,000 a year, or strictly actually earning at least the pay period equivalent of £10,000 in any pay period. So if they're paid monthly, a 12th of £10,000 in that month, and that does mean that people with volatile earnings can fluctuate in and out of eligibility pay period to pay period, and sometimes have contributions paid and other times not. And then there are various additional rules around people who aren't in that core group, the rights they have to either opt in and receive an employer contribution, or in some cases opt in but not have the right to an employer contribution. Similar again to OregonSaves, the rollout of the UK system was done based on the size of employer. So we started in October 2012 with the largest firms, and then by 2017 we were down to all firms employing, all firms or employers employing at least one person. And also borrowing from the behavioural literature around automatic escalation, we also introduced the contribution rates first at a lower overall level, and then escalated them up over time. So initially in that 2012-2017 period, people were contributing 1% of salary with 1% match from their employer, and then those numbers escalated up between 2017 and 2019 to the 8% level that you see today. So talk a little bit about how that seems to have played out in practice. So this is the kind of macro picture. So this is whole UK data rather than Nest-specific data from our Office of National Statistics. And the line that matters here is the green one at the top, which represents the proportion of workers contributing to any form of workplace or occupational pension. And you can see there that where the line demarcates 2012, the staged implementation of automatic enrolment from that point sees really quite a dramatic rise in overall participation in workplace pensions. And actually, if you kind of break that down to think about, is there anything within that at a demographic level that's any different? The answer is, in almost all cases, no. So whether you look at size of employer, employee income, disability, gender, really kind of however you cut the data, you see the same broad shape of a rise in participation. The only place where there's really any discernible differences between the public and the private sector, and a lot of that's a legacy to do with remaining very generous DB schemes in some parts of the public sector. Talk a little about opt-out rates. So this is Nest-specific data, and I think what's interesting about this is in population terms, I haven't put the data in this presentation, but in population terms, this is the same population as John was talking about, right? So we're talking about generally lower income workers, we're talking about those in traditionally poorly served sectors, particularly sectors which have very high levels of labour market turnover. But the overall opt-out rates in Nest are materially lower than the opt-out rates that you see in OregonSaves, and without the same kind of missing market of people who don't appear to have opted out, but also don't have a positive account balance. And just to explain this chart, the darker block colour, those are the opt-out rates. This is during the stage implementation period. Those are the opt-out rates for the initial stock of employees. So each employer, when they hit their staging date, was required to enrol all of their employees who weren't already saving in a pension. And the lighter line is the opt-out rate for subsequent new joiners to those new employees in those firms. So what you see is that in almost all cases, that initial stock opt-out rate is somewhat higher than the flow opt-out rate for new employees, which is leveled out at a lower level. And although this chart isn't terribly up to date, there's very little difference today in the trend, in that light blue trend line, to what we were seeing by the end of the stage implementation. So the opt-out rate has been hovering around 10%, both in Nest and in other schemes around the UK, kind of ever since that point. Just a further thing to pick up on in terms of the behaviours and the contribution rates. So the way the legislation in the UK is framed sets out, as I said, a minimum requirement for contribution rates, a minimum of 8% of a band of earnings, of which at least 3% comes from the employer. Employers are free to do more, either more of the 8 or a higher overall default rate. But what you see, at least in Nest, is that about 3/4 of employers using Nest do so at that default minimum rate. So the vast majority of employers are doing the regulatory minimum that's required of them. There's a range of variation around that. Talk just briefly about resilience. In the face of the pandemic, cost of living crisis, and also actually, there's no chart here, but I can talk to resilience as the minimum contribution rate rose as well, because I think the reference earlier to the finding that as default contribution rates increase, opt-outs are likely to increase as well, wasn't really seen in the UK when that minimum contribution rate rose in 2018 and then again in 2019. In the 2018 rise, there was almost no change in the opt-out rate, and in the 2019 increase, there was a small, but in the scheme of things, not hugely significant increase in the opt-out rate. You then look at behaviours through the pandemic, and what you can see on the chart here, or the 4 charts here rather, are the greyed out sectors of the charts are the major lockdown periods that we went through in the UK, and this is just comparing things like opt-out and cessation rates, and also withdrawal rates for those at 55 and age over 55, which in the UK system is the first point at which you can really withdraw without complexity or penalty. And the data's pretty noisy, but kind of fundamentally what we find is behaviours didn't really change through any of those lockdown periods either. So that meant that these behaviours are pretty persistent to increases in minimum contributions. They've been pretty persistent to a major exogenous kind of economic incident, and we are beginning to get the sense that they also aren't changing in relation to what in the UK at least is a very acute cost of living situation at the moment, with inflation rates running at sort of 8-9%, although it's maybe a little bit early to know for sure whether that will hold. Which is a neat way into, I think, just talking about some of the potential challenges with the system as we see it. So all of the evidence that's already been cited by my fellow panellists suggests that where you use automatic enrolment, people are very unlikely to opt out. Now, whether that be unlikely at the 401k or the Nest level, or somewhat more likely in the OregonSaves model, nonetheless, that nudge does seem to work. and all the sort of literature behind that talks, there's a number of reasons why that may be true, but one of them is simply inertia, right? So people don't get around to starting saving for retirement, and when you opt them in, they don't get around to stopping. But that inertia does, at least in our data, seem to follow through into some downstream behaviours, and this is where some of the slightly bigger challenges, I think, arise, and this is consistent with research that Shlomo Benazzi and others have done, looking at behavioural differences in the 401k system between those who opt in versus those who are auto-enrolled. So what you tend to see is that once people are auto-enrolled, they are very, very passive behaviourally in terms of other levels of engagement that you could see with them and their retirement plans. So in the case of Nest, only about 31% of Nest's members have activated their online account, which in effect means 2/3 of our members have never logged on to do anything in the management of their Nest account. About 99% of Nest's members remain in the default investment fund, and just to be clear, that is not a bad thing as far as we're concerned. The default fund was designed for that purpose, but it is, I think, further evidence of very low levels of downstream behaviour in the plan. Only about 1% of members make any additional contributions over and above the default rate at which their employer sets up the plan. And while it's too early to say with any confidence what behaviours look like at the decumulation end of the spectrum, there's at least some evidence as well that people are pretty passive at that point as well. And so kind of overall, the conclusion here is people who are automatically enrolled, on the upside, very unlikely to opt out, which means that you do create that base level of retirement savings behaviour, but they're also very unlikely to do much else, and that starts to raise questions around whether their retirement strategies are appropriate, optimal, sufficient, however you want to describe it, and some risk as well that there's a sense of anchoring to the rates that the government's defined, and therefore the risk that kind of downstream as people come to retirement, if that doesn't meet their expectations for an income in retirement, whether that'll create some stress and friction in the system in terms of public attitudes to its effectiveness and appropriateness. And then, of course, the other big challenge in the UK system is that we've, one might argue, substantially tackled at least the participation or coverage density challenge in the traditional workplace. That doesn't do anything for the self-employed population, and that's a critical issue in the UK because of the pace at which self-employment has been increasing. So what this chart shows is just the balance of different forms of employment in the UK over time, and what you can see is that yellow line in the middle there, the red line through the middle there is the sort of long-term increase in the number of self-employed people driving a lot of overall labour market activity, and as of just before the pandemic, something like 1 in 7 UK workers was predominantly self-employed, about 5 million people, so it's a significant portion of the UK workforce. And clearly automatic enrolment as structured as an obligation on employers does nothing to address pensions saving behaviours among that group, and you can see that starting off here with a kind of equal index of 100, the decline in overall participation that we saw in that earlier chart prior to 2012 switches a corner for employees, but just carries on for the self-employed, carries on declining, and we think today about 15% of that 5 million people are making any kind of regular contribution to a pension plan. So a really, really dramatic coverage gap among that self-employed group. In Nest, we've done some research around this to look at, firstly, do we understand kind of why that is, and what we find kind of unsurprisingly is that some of the barriers for the self-employed are exactly the same as the barriers that would have been true for the traditionally employed previously. People find pensions complex, they don't get around to it. Very similar, a lot of self-employed people will say they understand they should be doing something for their retirement. They're concerned about the fact they're not doing something for retirement, so kind of expressing some sort of intention that they should be doing something down the road. But then there are some barriers as well for the self-employed which are unique to them, and in particular the one that we think is particularly important is this idea of income volatility and the need for flexibility that arises from that. So because there's no pre-55 access to retirement savings in the UK, I think the perception among the self-employed is if I have a good month this month, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to have a good month next month, and so I want that additional money there for me and available to smooth the difference, and I may want it available to invest in my business if I need it, and so that tends to be a barrier towards formal pension saving and tends to drive the self-employed towards sort of self-describing other retirement income strategies or retirement saving strategies which often involve their business or property or more liquid savings that aren't necessarily going to generate the same returns for people over the long term, and also where we tend to see what looks a lot like overconfidence around their ability really to convert those assets into an income in retirement when they need it. So we've also done some experimental research around this group, and the work we've published talks about identifying potentially salient messages for the self-employed, sort of particularly designed around their attitudes and their concerns. So we tested in a randomised trial setting a range of different message interventions with the self-employed across 2 different self-employed populations. And essentially what we find is they make a bit of a difference, but it's pretty marginal. I mean, it's statistically significant in some cases, but it's not what you might think of as economically significant. You're talking about small increases in levels of engagement and very small increases in downstream levels of contributions. So we think from that there may well be things that providers can do and that the industry can do to change behaviours at the margin, but it's unlikely necessarily to be a really significant shift of the kind we might need to see to address that 15% number. We've now moved on. We've got some trials in the field at the moment that are trying to use the platforms that the self-employed use to manage their money, so things like payments platforms, accounting platforms, to see whether it's possible to build in more auto-enrollment like nudges into those kind of platforms to get a little bit closer to the kind of automatic diversion of pay that you see with traditional employers. They're still in progress, but again, I think what we're finding is we expect to see some positive behaviours, but possibly nothing that's much more than kind of marginal against the overall scale of the problem. And it's also worth saying that those types of interventions from a public policy perspective are extremely difficult to scale, because in effect you'd need to regulate all of the payments industry, all of the accounting software industry, all of the fintech money management platform industry, and probably half the banks if you wanted to reach right across, kind of universally right across a set of touch points that work for all self-employed people. So increasingly our thinking in this space is, I should say there's one thing I didn't put on this slide, but we had begun to discuss and that came up a lot yesterday, is the whole idea of save as you spend. I think that's an area that could be particularly applicable to self-employed populations. But I think beyond that, we really think at least one, if not a couple of 3 things needs to happen. One is something much closer to automatic enrolment through some kind of universal touch point, and our best guess is that that's probably the tax self-assessment system, because that's pretty much the only thing that all self-employed people consistently have to do, and it's being increasingly digitised in ways that might lend itself to more of an automatic enrolment type nudge in the future. I think there's something about the salience and generosity of financial incentives for the self-employed who lack the employer match as a financial incentive to save. They are entitled to tax relief on their contributions, but question, could something be done to make that entitlement more salient and apparent to them, because it's a bit kind of hidden and complicated at the moment, and or could it be made more generous? And then I think the third thing we're really interested in, and it links to some of the previous content, is whether for the self-employed actually what we think of as a traditional pension is the wrong product because of its lack of liquidity and accessibility, and whether you actually need something that blends a bit better a precautionary component, which to the point made earlier, may for them be an incentive to start saving in the first place if you take away that concern that the money won't be there for them if they need it for some other purpose pre-retirement. Just the last couple of comments. So I was just going to talk a little bit about some of the kind of emerging policy debates now in the UK. As I said, the auto-enrollment intervention is 10 years old this year. Nest is actually 11 years old, and there's increasingly now discussion about kind of what comes next with auto-enrollment. Our minister describes it as auto-enrollment 2.0, because it seems to be more or less obligatory in UK policy to add 2.0 anytime you're thinking about updating a previous policy. So that's the kind of major focus of these discussions at the moment. So the first is around excluded groups, and I've already talked about the self-employed, but also around a sort of emerging debate around the gender pensions gap and the ethnic minority pensions gap. I think it's worth saying, at least on the gender front, that gap doesn't appear to be behavioural within the retirement system. So we've looked in some depth at the data in Nest, controlling for income, controlling for sector of the economy, and once you do those things, there's no evidence of a behavioural difference between men and women in Nest around contribution levels or around propensity to opt out or cease contributions. So that the gender pensions gap at least appears to be structural, i.e. directly tied to the gender pay gap. I think that raised some interesting questions for how, within a policy framework, you resolve that. And I wondered, and was going to ask yesterday but ran out of time, I think it's possible that financial credits within funded second pillar systems to balance the gender pay gap might be one of the cases in which using the funded pillar 2 for a redistributive goal might be a legitimate reason to kind of blur the lines a bit between the different pillars of the World Bank model, but that's maybe a debate we could have when we have some time. I think the other major set of issues now is around the scope of auto-enrollment. So there's an open debate about whether the 22 entry age should be reduced to 18 so that people start saving sooner, and an emerging debate about whether the £10,000 income limit should be lowered or abolished to essentially bring all workers, or more or less all workers, in scope of automatic enrolment. And there's also a debate about the adequacy of the 8% contribution rate and whether that should be increased either by abolishing the band of earnings definition, which means that at the moment your contributions are only calculated from an income of £6,000 up. So if you abolish that, you'll obviously cover more people's income and increase their contributions, and or whether the 8% should simply go up over time, and if it does go up over time, how that should be balanced between individuals and employers. And I think the sort of final comment I'd make is all of that debate is being had against a backdrop of post-pandemic and cost of living crisis, a question about for whom is 8% not enough versus their capacity to consume today, versus for whom actually is it probably about right, and does that, what does that mean for the uniform nature of the 8% minimum contribution that we see today? Do we need to move towards some kind of differentiation for different levels of income, or do we need to move towards building in a bit more precautionary accessibility so that if that rate's going to go up, those on lower income still have access to some of that money to protect them against the risk that they're in effect saving too much given their capacity to consume today. I'll stop there because I'm a minute over time, but thank you very much for your time and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Will.